Welcome to Lady Margaret Hall and to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism for the lecture tonight. Thank you for making the journey. And I'm Alan Rusbridger, the chair of the steering committee of the Reuters Institute, and I'm just here to introduce our speaker tonight, A.G. Sulzberger. To be born into the Sulzberger family, which owns the New York Times, is the nearest the American Republic comes to the monarchy. Short of abdication, a life of duty lies ahead, and the only question is whether you end up as a duffer like King Stephen or Henry VI, or a glorious one like Elizabeth I or William and Mary. It's early days, but I think we can already say that our speaker tonight is at the extremely positive end of the scale. He took over as publisher of the New York Times just over 6 years ago after learning the ropes on the Providence Journal and the Oregonian. His term has, to some extent, coincided with that of Donald J. Trump, for whom the New York Times was public enemy number one. There was a meeting that I think was intended to be off the record, but then went on the record, in which A.G. stood his ground with the president, telling him to his face that his anti-press rhetoric was, quotes, not just divisive, but increasingly dangerous. And people began to take notice of the new pretender at the New York Times. I think I had already spotted this up-and-coming talent in 2013 when the paper he'd been commissioned to write about the digital transformation of the New York Times was leaked to BuzzFeed. And it turned out to be extremely good. It was very thoughtful, wide-ranging, and ambitious. Then something else became apparent about our guest tonight. Whereas many proprietors and publishers and CEOs shy away from the limelight and are only capable of corporate speak and show little interest in journalism as opposed to the business of journalism, I can think of no other leader who could who speaks with the clarity and knowledge and, frankly, love of journalism that A.G. has shown in his pronouncements. He wrote an extremely long, clear and thoughtful essay called Journalism's Essential Value, which he penned for the Columbia Journalism Review last year. I can't think of another proprietor or publisher who would have had the courage to sit down with David Remnick for 45 minutes and subject himself to 45 minutes of questioning, let alone sitting down as he's just done with Lionel Barber and myself, Media Confidential, which will be out on Thursday. And once again, he was super smart, open, and perceptive. So he's a really interesting monarch. And it's with great pleasure, I know we're in for a treat, to invite him up to give this year's Reuters Institute lecture, and it'll be followed by a discussion chaired by Rasmus Nielsen. A.G., please.
Well, thank you, Alan, for that generous introduction. So it's an honor to be here today to deliver this year's memorial lecture. The Reuters Institute has been such an invaluable resource to so many of us in the industry who are engaged in the difficult work of trying to pave a path forward for quality journalism in this era. And I feel especially lucky to receive a warm welcome here in Oxford, despite my institution's many, and I assure you here, entirely unintentional affronts to British culture, such as our blasphemous suggestion that a full English breakfast can be cooked on a single baking tray in the oven. Hopefully all your monarch talk will warm the country back up to us. In the relatively short time since I was asked to speak today, the bad news about the news industry has somehow gotten even worse. It's not a good sign when two different magazines both use the phrase extinction level event in headlines about the outlook for news organizations. In my country, about a third of all newsroom jobs have disappeared in the last 15 years, and local newspapers continue to close at a rate of more than 2 a week. The journalists lucky enough to still have jobs often lack the basic support they need to do original reporting of consequence, not just money, but time, the guidance of experienced editors, and the ability to go to the places and talk to the people they're writing about. If that weren't enough, the actual work of journalism has become harder as well. Threats, harassment, and attacks on journalists continue to escalate, stoked by anti-press rhetoric that calls journalism fake news and journalists enemy of the people. And of course, this is not just a problem confined to the United States or Britain. Around the globe, near record numbers of journalists are being killed and jailed. And increasingly aggressive efforts to strip long-standing journalistic rights are undermining independent reporting, even in countries that have historically supported free expression and a free press. As news organizations strain against those pressures, they have to compete in an information ecosystem that is dominated by a handful of tech giants and polluted with misinformation, conspiracy theories, propaganda, and clickbait, all of which are further eroding trust in media. The Reuters Institute tells us that Americans' trust in media, once robust, now regularly ranks among the lowest in the world, well behind countries where the media is controlled by repressive governments. Britain fares only slightly better. And now the arrival of generative artificial intelligence promises to worsen all those challenges facing news organizations, unless those developing this powerful technology and the frameworks to regulate it ensure AI is used to support a trustworthy news ecosystem rather than hasten its demise. So why, when my profession faces more existential threats than you can fit in a big-budget horror movie, have I decided to come here to talk about the comparatively esoteric concept of journalistic independence? Because this era has made journalistic independence harder than ever, and rarer than ever, and I believe more important than ever. The world is grappling with giant challenges, from accelerating climate change to persistent inequality to technological disruption to democratic erosion to seemingly intractable global conflicts. Meanwhile, epidemics of misinformation and polarization are making the search for solutions ever more elusive. Overcoming those forces and bringing communities together to understand the options, to make hard decisions, and to take action requires trustworthy facts and mutual understanding. And facts and understanding are precisely what independent journalism offers society. Yet in my role as publisher of the New York Times, I continued to be startled by the growing resistance to independent journalism. Not long ago, from my office window in Midtown Manhattan, I watched a mass of people protesting our supposed anti-Palestinian bias while they stood directly below a billboard denouncing our supposed anti-Israel bias. It left me with the unnerving realization that an increasingly self-sorted and intensely polarized public is perhaps most unified in the belief that any journalist who challenges their side's narrative is getting the story wrong. Today, I'd like to make the case for the importance of independent journalism. And I'd like to do so not by singing our greatest hits, but by talking about our fiercely contested coverage of some of society's most polarizing and difficult to talk about issues, such as the war in Ukraine, debates over trans rights, and the conflict in the Middle East. And to be clear, I'm not camping out on the third rail because I want to get zapped. I'm addressing these topics because the issues that most divide us are also those that most benefit from an independent press committed to collecting the facts, providing the context, and fostering the understanding needed for solutions. They're also the issues on which the posture of independence is most likely to be attacked as amoral, even dangerous. As such pushback becomes the predictable cost of pursuing independent journalism, it's important to understand the dynamics behind it, and perhaps the surprising feeling that I believe often animates it. Let me pause here to define what I mean by journalistic independence. You can think of it as a first-order commitment to open-mindedness. Journalistic independence demands a willingness to follow the facts, even when they lead you away from what you assumed or hoped would be true. A willingness to engage at once empathetically and skeptically with a wide variety of people and perspectives. An insistence on reflecting the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. A posture of curiosity rather than of conviction, of humility rather than righteousness. Where there is overwhelming evidence, independence means plainly stating the facts, even if they appear to favor one side. And in the much more frequent cases, when the facts are unclear or their interpretation under reasonable debate, independence means empowering readers to understand and digest that ambiguity for themselves. Independence does not mean both sidesism. It doesn't mean centrism or neoliberalism or a defense of the status quo. And it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for inaccurate or unfair coverage. It's also not an innate personal characteristic that any of us were born with. It's a professional discipline to which journalists must recommit every day. This discipline is rooted in process. Things like soliciting a range of perspectives, confirmation from multiple sources, fact-checking, ethics guidelines, prohibitions on conflicts of interest. It requires diversity in the broadest sense. Newsrooms that embrace journalists with different backgrounds and worldviews will spot more stories and imbue them with greater nuance and insight. The discipline of independent journalism also requires no small amount of personal courage. You need to be willing to challenge conventional wisdom and groupthink. You need to be willing to take a simple, easy, or comfortable story and complicate it with truths that people don't want to hear. More than ever, you need to be willing to show resilience amid the torrent of harassment and abuse that often follows publication. And you need to be willing to acknowledge that we don't always get it right, that sometimes the critics have a point. Independence shouldn't be used as a shield to fend off legitimate complaints or to hide from errors. Like every news organization, the Times gets things wrong, sometimes very wrong. Our past failures on important stories like the Iraq War or the AIDS crisis give us plenty of reasons for humility. Pursuing the truth wherever it leads means recognizing our own mistakes and correcting them fully and transparently. That too is independence. What independent journalism looks like in practice evolves continually, but at its heart, it remains the same model of journalism that my great-great-grandfather, Adolph Ochs, championed when he pledged in 1896 that the New York Times would give the news impartially, without fear or favor, regardless of party, sect, or interests involved. 5 generations of my family have made it our life's work to honor that commitment and to spread the word. But journalistic independence has always had its critics. It's long been contested by those on the right, who see it as masking a pervasive liberal bias in newsrooms. It's long been contested by those on the left, who argue that independence privileges a straight white male worldview that props up existing power structures. And it's increasingly contested by some journalists who argue that a society grappling with existential challenges cannot afford an impartial press focused more on sharing information than crusading for change. Independence, in this view, is a peacetime luxury. But the newest dynamic, the most difficult to navigate, is that the posture of journalistic independence is now contested by nearly every group we cover on nearly every issue we cover. In just the last few years, the Times has been called anti-white, anti-Asian, anti-Inuit, anti-Hindu, anti-Catholic, and anti-Hasidic, anti-Africa, and anti-Europe. We've been called anti-public schools and anti-Harvard, anti-fracking and anti-environment, anti-CEO and anti-union, anti-Elon Musk and anti-Queen Elizabeth. We were called that. None of these are true, for the record. Anti-crypto and anti-yoga pants. Also true. Sadly, that is far from a complete list. Why is this happening? Like never before, the social media era encourages the public to self-sort in communities, unified by shared identity, interest, or worldview. These groups form their own narratives, which harden and become more extreme. Louder voices rise to the top, as they inevitably do in digital environments, and these echo chambers celebrate work that conforms to their narratives and protest anything that challenges them. These views are often sincerely held, but the fundamental goal of the cheers and jeers is to change coverage, making what gets reported more favorable to their interests and making it more uncomfortable to report things they don't like. Sometimes this involves seizing on offending pieces in isolation as evidence of a broader agenda, instead of viewing them in the context of a larger body of coverage that explores an issue from many angles and many perspectives. One study showed that most people don't even read a piece before posting about it on social media, meaning that complaints are often best understood as demonstrations of in-group solidarity rather than informed critiques. The Washington Post columnist Philip Bump recently described this type of criticism as a, quote, omnipresent rumble from those emboldened to hate reporting that challenges them and to see those reporters as a threat. Tressie McMillan Cottom, a columnist for the Times opinion section, explained that the public is avoiding shared spaces in favor of ideological encampments. Quote, we don't just want personalized content, we want personalized content that affirms and does not challenge our political identities. And David French, another columnist for the Times, suggested these dynamics are fueling, quote, arguably the most comprehensively, voluntarily, and cooperatively misinformed generation of people to ever walk the earth. We're misinformed not because the government is systematically lying or suppressing the truth. We're misinformed because we like the misinformation we receive and are eager for more. Whether they've self-sorted over political orientation, nationality, race, gender, religion, profession, or anything else, the vast majority of these groups I've come to believe are animated by essentially the same feeling, a profound, perhaps even existential sense of vulnerability. In many cases, this feeling of vulnerability is understandable. We're living in a period in which many feel threatened, often in ways that are justified, by rising intolerance and massive inequality, by social instability and tear down the system's zeal. But history shows that tribalism, polarization, and narratives of vulnerability are a dangerous mix. In combination, they stoke absolutism, snuff out tolerance, and often give rise to the demand behind so many of society's worst episodes. Are you with us or against us? More and more, that question is leveled at journalists. And I can assure you that it is extremely tempting to make the case for journalistic independence through self-serving, feel-good examples that show how well the Times has modeled the value and how by doing so, we have changed the world for the better. Widely celebrated stories that show how we defied presidents to bring essential information to the public, as with the decision to publish the Pentagon Papers, how we exposed patterns of harassment and abuse at the hands of prominent men, helping to spark the Me Too movement, how we revealed secrets that powerful people and governments wanted to keep under wraps, forcing meaningful accountability and reform in countless areas of public interest, from documenting the widespread illegal employment of migrant children in dangerous jobs, to exposing how America's drone warfare program has been systematically plagued by flawed intelligence, imprecise targeting, and disregard for human life. But the best way to know whether you're living your values is not the cases that are celebrated, but those that are contested. I think of my colleague who was called a Republican pawn for exposing Hillary Clinton's private email server, and then called a Democratic pawn for exposing Donald Trump's many efforts to undermine investigations into his actions. Or my colleagues who angered every side of the abortion debate by listening to every side of the abortion debate, and then doing their best to fairly represent all those perspectives. And I'm going to explore some high-profile examples like these, not to sound defensive or beleaguered, but to illustrate the difficult daily reality of independent journalism and to make clear why the fight is worth it. Let's start in Ukraine. When Russia stunned the world 2 years ago by invading Ukraine in an unprovoked act of aggression, our reporters had already been covering the escalating tensions for months. They've remained on the ground ever since, braving the same bombs and gunfire as the Ukrainian people, to bring the public essential information about the conflict. We've documented Russia's atrocities, its military failures, and the ways it has misled and persecuted its own peoples. We produced groundbreaking investigations that proved that Russian soldiers systematically killed Ukrainian civilians, evidence that has since been used in war crimes investigations. We shared stories not just of the conflict, but of the Ukrainians who have taken up arms, lost their lives, or started life over, far from home. But sometimes our journalists find a story that the Ukrainian leaders don't want told. We reported that the country's military had been using internationally banned cluster munitions, which disproportionately kill civilians, particularly children. We reported that Ukrainian generals were experiencing such serious shortages of equipment on the front lines that they often traded supplies amongst themselves. The Ukrainian leadership, which often denounces journalism that challenges their official narratives as Russian propaganda, have at times punished our correspondents when they write such stories. And the Ukrainians are, understandably, trying to avoid anything that has the barest likelihood of further imperiling their country, of emboldening their enemies, of eroding support from their allies, or sapping the confidence of their own people. But a desire not to know, born of fear, is one of the most counterproductive of human impulses. Independent reporting is essential if the public, including the Ukrainian public, is to understand the reality of the situation on the ground. A true accounting of supply shortages, for example, is essential to Ukrainian decision-making, from knowing how to best deploy limited resources to the front line to understanding the urgency of additional international military support. Let me offer a second example, involving another group that has good reason to feel at risk. In the last few years, the Times has extensively covered the surge of anti-trans measures advancing through legislatures in the United States. We've reported on the attacks and discrimination that trans people face. And we have highlighted the stories of trans people around the world who are breaking barriers and gaining new recognition. We have also covered, fairly and empathetically, debates about medical interventions for trans children, an issue where there is disagreement even among the trans community, parents, and medical providers who specialize in such care. This last group of articles make up a small percentage of our overall coverage, perhaps a dozen out of many hundreds of pieces. But they've been continually questioned and promoted by trans activists as evidence that the Times as a whole is, quote, questioning trans people's right to exist. Many of the critiques are not focused on the facts we've reported, but on the impact those facts could have in the wrong hands. They point to examples where our reporting has been cited in legislation and lawsuits by those seeking to restrict the rights for trans people, including medical care. The argument that information that could be misused shouldn't be revealed at all is obviously unjournalistic. Doing so would give the public good reason to believe that journalists are reshaping reality in service of an agenda. And that in turn would make it harder to get the public to believe anything else we've published. But it can also do a disservice to the very people these critics are trying to defend. In this case, we know that our reporting has been an invaluable resource for children, parents, and medical providers making decisions about care. We've had trans people reach out to say that if the Times stops its reporting on these issues, they fear that they will be left to make important medical decisions based not on science, but on talking points. And we've had doctors who have dedicated their lives to providing care for trans people share their alarm that those who even raise the possibility that this still emergent medical field may need to continue to evolve will be dismissed and ostracized. After investigating complaints about our coverage, one media critic concluded, quote, "The real purpose of the effort against the Times is to discourage in-depth stories on trans health care or to put an end to such coverage altogether." Then there is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no story that is more fiercely contested, more mired in competing zero-sum narratives. Two peoples who claim the same land, each with arguments grounded not just in history, but in religion. Two peoples whose past and present offer a multitude of reasons to feel existential vulnerability. Independent journalism is needed to provide information, to hold those in power to account, and to expose the experiences of those on all sides, giving the public the opportunity to understand what's driving the conflict and what's keeping it from moving towards resolution. My colleagues have painstakingly detailed the October 7th attacks, showing how Hamas fighters invaded Israel, how they killed, sexually assaulted, and abducted more than 1,000 people, and how they retreated to a tunnel system designed to protect fighters at the cost of civilians. My colleagues have documented the scale of Israel's destruction of Gaza and the massive death toll of civilians, particularly children. We exposed Israel's widespread use of 2,000-pound bombs that defy precision, the deliberate demolition of schools and mosques and homes, and the struggle for basic necessities like food, water, shelter, and medical care. We broke stories about how Israeli officials ignored detailed warnings about Hamas's plans more than a year before the terrorist attack. And in a conflict in which both sides too often fail to see each other's humanity, we have told the stories of people who may share nothing but anguish. A Palestinian grandmother who refuses to leave her home in Gaza during bombardments because she has already lost her home once in 1948. A Holocaust survivor who spends her days worrying about whether her kidnapped grandson is still alive. A Palestinian child orphaned by the airstrike that killed dozens of her family members. A 4-year-old Israeli girl who was taken hostage by Hamas after witnessing them murder her parents. Those on each side of the conflict will find stories they like and dislike in that list. But independent reporting, the kind that doesn't fully align with any one perspective, will never win over the partisans. Critics of our Middle East coverage accuse us of bias in what stories we choose to publish, in the context we provide or leave out. They challenge the photos we run, the language we use, the sources we cite. Some say that a story on the plight of Israeli hostages erases civilian deaths in Gaza. Others claim a piece exploring Hamas's motivations for the massacre in Israel platforms terrorists. To do anything short of denouncing bad people or opinions is to normalize them. To challenge good people or opinions is to succumb to both sidesism. Even a seemingly straightforward word like killed is contested. Wouldn't died be more neutral? Wouldn't murdered be more accurate? As inconceivable as it sounds to those with strong views about the conflict, the accusations saying we are biased against the Israelis or biased against the Palestinians are almost always equal in volume and intensity. One morning in November, I received a letter from a U.S. senator, the first of several such notes from state and federal officials, irresponsibly suggesting that the Times may have provided, quote, material support to Hamas terrorists. The very next day, pro-Palestinian protesters marched to the Times headquarters, where they dumped fake blood while insisting the very opposite thing, that we were complicit in the killing of Palestinians. Still, it's telling that even as both sides use inflammatory rhetoric to steer public opinion, they're quick to reference our journalism when it aligns with their narratives. During the genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, both Israel's accusers and defenders cited our coverage. Criticism is increasingly aimed not just at our work, but at our journalists themselves. The Times has an especially diverse team covering this conflict, one that includes Muslims, Jews, and Christians, speakers of Arabic, Hebrew, and English. Some grew up in the conflict and have lost friends and relatives to it. Others have studied it from the outside, some for decades. Critics see this diversity as fodder for pushback. Does a journalist's background reveal a hidden bias? What about the words and background of the journalist's spouse or father or children? Indeed, I've felt this myself. Both sides have long put forward theories about why my family's leadership at the Times stokes unfairness, either because our Jewish roots make us naturally biased in favor of Israel, or because they lead us to bend too far the other way. Advocates will even find pseudoscientific ways to quantify our supposed bias. One news outlet published an analysis of word usage in our coverage that found that the Times, quote, heavily favored Israel. Another news outlet provided a different analysis under the headline, quote, proof that the New York Times anti-Israel bias is empirical, not paranoia. To be absolutely clear, I am not saying that the truth usually lies in the middle, in this conflict or in any other. Indeed, there are usually many sides, not just two. And I don't believe that a news organization must be doing something right because people on all sides are angry. But it's also not a sign that a news organization must be doing something wrong. Indeed, it would be impossible to produce fair, accurate coverage of this particular conflict without making all sides angry. The president of the International Committee of the Red Cross recently made the case for the value of independent actors in even the most fiercely contested conflicts in a guest essay in the Times. Not everybody needs to be neutral, she wrote. But nations need to respect the space for humanitarian neutrality. When the world takes sides, we side with humanity. It's important for me to restate clearly that being open to good faith criticism is an essential part of the journalistic process. A news organization that cuts itself off from such feedback is destined to make more and bigger mistakes. That's why the Times takes claims of error so seriously, with an entire team of standards editors to investigate and respond to concerns. When we make mistakes, we correct them promptly and openly, and then strive to learn from them in the future. For example, early in the Israel-Gaza war, we ran a headline that was overly credulous of Hamas's claims that Israel was responsible for a deadly explosion at a hospital in Gaza City. The headline was updated within hours. Still, while some others who have made the same mistake simply moved on, we spent days investigating what happened, published an editor's note that publicly explained our errors, and committed to improving our processes. In this way, a robust correction section should be viewed with pride rather than embarrassment, as a testament of a news organization's willingness to hold itself to account. However, in many of the cases above, advocates aren't pushing back against the facts, but instead warning that the facts could cause harm by hurting their cause or emboldening their enemy. They insist that our coverage will end up on the wrong side of history. But what does it mean to be a journalist who approaches their work with the aim of being on the right side of history? Of course, any reasonable journalist would want future generations to look back at their work as standing the test of time. But the instinct to write for the future judgment of history, rather than the public we serve today, can lead even the most well-intentioned journalist astray in three ways. First, everyone wants to make the right decisions, but it is not always clear as the news unfolds what right means. Claims to the moral high ground in the moment, like the war on terror or defund the police, haven't always aged well. Second, seeking to drive towards a particular right outcome creates incentives to twist reality, hyping facts that align with your case and downplaying those that don't. That approach is fundamentally at odds with journalism's responsibility to inform the public and undermines the long-term trust that any news organization depends on. This is the trap that Fox News is in, contorting the news to serve a political mission and leaving its own viewers badly misinformed in the process, believing that President Obama was born in Kenya or that President Trump won the last election. And third, writing for the future rather than the present front-runs the public, forsaking the important role journalism plays in helping society work through problems. That not only pushes the public to less informed decisions, it often invites backlash. For example, much of the public felt government responses to the COVID pandemic were overly restrictive, and the media's reporting on them insufficiently skeptical. This has contributed to declining support for vaccination programs and increased distrust in medical professionals. Simply put, journalists don't serve the public by trying to predict history's judgments or to steer society to them. Our job as journalists is firmly rooted in the present, to arm society with the information and context it needs to thoughtfully grapple with the issues of the day. The belief that an informed public makes better decisions is perhaps the most hopeful conceit of an independent press. Not long ago, one of our most experienced foreign correspondents told me the story of a dinner he attended at an American university. One guest confronted him angrily, saying she could not believe the overwhelming pro-Palestinian bias appearing every day on the Times' homepage. Another guest at the table quickly countered that he was appalled by the Times' constant pro-Israel bias. Incredulous, they both proceeded to list examples to prove their case. After a long back and forth, the dispute ended in impasse. There was mutual incomprehension, the reporter said. That mutual incomprehension now exists seemingly everywhere. And helping people understand the facts and each other is one of the greatest services journalism can provide the public. As that foreign correspondent put it to me, if the fear and rage of the public conversation is ever to cede to civility and to create space for solutions, there has to be a foundation for discussion built around independent reporting. As you have heard in the examples I've shared today, we are often told that this kind of posture, the posture of independent reporting, represents a moral abdication. But when I look at the forces keeping society from coming together to rise to the challenges of our era, whether in the Middle East, Ukraine, the United States, or anywhere else, I see no lack of passionate, morally confident actors sounding the alarm. Indeed, the alarm seems so loud and so constant that much of the public by now has put in earplugs. I view the posture of independence as the better, more optimistic path. As independent journalists, we empower our fellow citizens with the information they need to make decisions for themselves. That is a profound act of trust, of courage, of confidence. I remain clear-eyed about the ways that misinformation and polarization conspire to block the shared reality that society needs to come together. But I believe that the answer to those scourges can be found not in an advocate's crusading righteousness, but in a journalist's humility and his humbler mission to seek the truth and to help people understand the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, AG, for that lecture. I'm very pleased to be joined now on the panel here by our speakers tonight, of course, but also with other great friends of the Reuters Institute who can speak to these issues that have been raised. So Alexander Galoni, the executive editor of Reuters, our namesakes and proud friends. Melissa Bell, who is currently a visiting fellow at the Institute and previously was publisher at Vox Media. And Zafar Abbas, editor-in-chief of Dawn newspaper in Pakistan and a member of the Institute's advisory board. So I want to start first really with the title and main theme of your lecture of journalistic independence. And I think it's interesting that...
Do I have to admit now that I've forgotten the title? That's sort of an odd angle.
We are in Oxford, and I am a professor, and I am tempted to walk us through each word in turn, but I promise I won't do it. I think that would only amuse me and a few others. But I do think we should start with the notion of journalistic independence, and I think it's interesting that several of the examples that you give are around the Times international reporting, because I think for a long time, the way much of the profession thought of independence was primarily through the lens of independence from major domestic political actors and organized interests. two major parties in a country and major business concerns. But of course, you operate internationally, and as does Reuters very much. So I want to start with you, Alexander, on this notion of journalistic independence. I mean, how do you think about the challenges that AG described around independence, in particular when you're dealing with these complicated international stories that also serve a complicated global audience?
Yes, thank you, and I really enjoyed your speech. We are very similar in many ways, and a lot of the things that you said, we talk about it in our newsroom. So I guess I'll answer I'll offer sort of 2 points. One is sort of quite tailored to Reuters, and another one I think is more general. The one that is more tailored for Reuters is, I mean, for us, independence is rooted in everything that we do, partly because it is one of the tenets of our trust principles, which are these sort of commandments, these 5 commandments that we abide by in everything that we do. In all of our reporting, they date back to 1941, which interestingly was also a period in which you had a world war, in which there were also concerns about bias, concerns about propaganda from governments, and these trust principles were created in part to maintain the independence of the company. Fast forward to now, we are a newsroom that operates in 200 countries. We employ 200 nationalities. We speak 200 languages in our newsroom, and our approach, and this gets to the independence question, is that we are certainly a global news organization because we're everywhere, but we are also a very local news organization in that we have journalists who work in their own countries. And so we believe that this sort of duality of reporters who work in their own countries coupled with editing desks, where you have a number of sort of internationals, if you will, that are working alongside reporters in their own countries, we feel that this is one way in which we approach and which sort of guarantees this independent journalism that we practice. Another way that we practice it is that we believe in being everywhere. And so we are in Washington, but we're also in Moscow. And in Moscow in particular was a very difficult decision. I think I actually spoke about it 2 years ago when I was here, but it was a very difficult decision that weekend, when essentially the Kremlin made it much harder for reporters to stay in, and we decided to stay in. And it was for a number of reasons, and we still firmly believe them, which is that we believe that you cannot fully understand a story and sort of a situation unless you are there and unless you listen to all sides. And so regularly now, on our news meetings, we'll have sort of the Washington bureau chief say, well, Washington believes that Putin is doing this, and our Moscow correspondent will say, well, actually here in Moscow, that is not what we are hearing. And that we feel that tension is sort of really, leads us to sort of that independence that helps our trusted journalism. So that's sort of the Reuters specific one. The second point I want to make, and then I'll hurry up, is you said something at the beginning, which I really, really believe in, and that is process. That very unsexy concept of process and discipline, but which I believe is fundamental to our profession. Obviously, we're a very creative bunch, right? I mean, journalist creativity is at the heart of what we do, but process is, if you will, sort of the bone structure. And without the bone structure, you can't do it. And that process involves seeking comment, making sure you're listening to all sides. That doesn't mean false equivalency, and I'm sure we'll get to that later. It means correcting your mistakes, right, which is fundamental. We've talked about it in this forum before. And it means also one thing that I would add is sort of opening yourself up to criticism, reporting on yourself, reporting on your parent company. You might like that less, but which is something that
I think the longest piece that we had ever published was our examination of the failures that led to the Jason Blair scandal. And I think at the time it was the longest piece we had ever published.
So again, I think I would say sort of for us, there's a unique sort of, for us in independent reporting is the globality coupled with sort of the locality, if you will. But then I think what is certainly true is that process and discipline really matters in the concept of independence and leading an unbiased newsroom.
Can I just push you first, Alexander, but also I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, AG. I think even people who believe in process and believe that everybody needs an editor, a surprising thought to hear from an editor, of course, and are willing to give news organizations the benefit of the doubt, may still feel that news organizations in Europe and North America are still viewing the world from a certain part of the world, and often end up reporting things in a way that's aligned with the geopolitical priorities of the political elite in those parts of the world. I mean, you have had that pushback at Reuters. I'm sure you've had that pushback at the New York Times. I mean, how do you respond to that?
I mean, about 20% of what we publish is in English. The rest is not in English. And I think that figure reflects our population and reflects the fact that we publish in, we have 200 languages in our newsroom, but we publish in 16. And so we regularly have people on our news meetings who are representing another narrative, who are saying that is not the way this is not the way, the view from Washington, New York, London, Paris is just not the way that we are seeing it here in our country. So we constantly have that pushback, and we try to listen to it all the time. Frankly, it's a commercial. Frankly, we have to, because many of our clients are not in the US or in the UK or in Europe. Many of them, if you added them together, in fact, probably all together would be the bulk, would be outside of these countries. So we have to.
Reggie?
To me, I think it's a fair question. And I think one of the good things that has come out of, one of the many good things that have come out of the internet era as it pertains to our industry, it's obviously brought a lot of challenge as well, is that the people we write about, we can now always assume are going to read what we've written, right? And it used to be that you could be a correspondent, whether a foreign correspondent or, my former job, Kansas City bureau chief, where I was reporting from rural Nebraska, and you wouldn't assume that the people you were writing about would see anything. Which means that, for us as a general interest news provider, we have to simultaneously write stuff that you never write for your sources, right? You never write for your subjects. But what you produce has to ring true, right? To those groups, right? And so we're simultaneously trying to sort of translate whatever it is we're writing about, whether it's an industry or a place, for the rest of the world, or an issue, right? For the rest of the world, while also simultaneously trying to do that in a way that the people closest to it will say, like, that's a fair description. And that's definitely more challenging than the old model, but it is such an improvement. To me, the underlying question, you use the word independence, like there's a tension of independence. I actually think it's a different tension than independence. I actually think it's just a case for diversity on staff. And that's sort of, in some ways, what you're pointing to is this like incredibly diverse staff you employ that are from the places you're writing about. And to me, it's a reminder of how centrally important diversity is to the type of journalism I'm talking about.
And do you feel that the New York Times has sort of reflect the diversity as an organization of serving a global audience, or a US audience, or a New York audience, or where would you say you are in that?
So, there's all sorts of different ways to measure diversity. I think on every single one, we have grown steadily more diverse in recent years, right? So, as with Reuters, we're, employing, more journalists from the countries we're covering, right? Where it used to be that we believed in sort of the fresh eye theory, that a country can only be covered, or a state can only be covered by an outsider. Or we're hiring, national correspondents with deep roots in parts of the country and who are applying that depth of expertise. So in all sorts of ways, I think we've grown more diverse. I don't think that there's some magic end point. I think that that's something that you're constantly committing yourselves to as an organization. As the stories in the world that are front and center continue to change?
I want to pick up on the issue of division, which is prominent, of course, in your lecture as well, and the relationship between divided society and journalistic independence. And I want to hear from Safar, from you, and from you, Melissa, and your perspectives on this. I think you lay out very clearly some of the challenges that deep divisions can represent journalistic independence. I can't help but wonder, however, whether consensus can also sometimes be a threat to journalistic independence. I mean, I think it's easy to look back on the sort of Cold War consensus as, crudely put, a period in which lots of powerful people agreed that communists were bad, economic growth was good, and that the central political issue was, what balance you thought between sort of public spending versus private enterprise, and that created the space for journalistic independence in one sense, but it also produced a very homogeneous public discourse that lots of people and point of view were left out of. And I think we don't have that problem right now in lots of societies. But I want to hear from people who have, I think, both very different experiences in Pakistan, but also a sort of slightly different editorial take at Vox from perhaps some of the things that AG outlines at Vox. So Safar, first to you in terms of how you think about this balance between independence and division.
You see, obviously, we are a very small news organization as compared to the New York Times or the kind of operation Reuters is running. But more or less, when I was hearing AG, the values are more or less the same if you believe in independence, if you believe in truthful journalism, and we get the same kind of attack and criticism and appreciation as a much bigger organization is getting. How to survive in an atmosphere where the government of the day doesn't like what you're reporting, or the security establishment or the intelligence services don't like what you're reporting, and how to survive. I've learned over a period of time, and it's a different experience, not to react to the campaign against you, whether some media organization is being used against Dawn, or some individuals or some other groups are being used against Dawn, but to continue to report and publish opinion that you believe in. And a day will come when people will start to recognize and trust you. And just to give you a small example, until the recent turmoil in Pakistan, we were being branded as an anti-Imran Khan newspaper. And today, the only newspaper that Imran Khan reads in jail is Dawn. So the thing is that because we have been very consistent with what we believe in, what truthfulness is, what factual journalism is, and of course, we have made mistakes, like you said, and we constantly make mistakes, but we have got an external ombudsman to take complaints and remind the editor that this is where we have gone wrong, and to admit those mistakes and to move on, but maintain our journalism the way we believe in our values is what has earned us a lot of respect among our readers and a larger audience.
I mean, in a sense, Vox was sort of born in an America that was already quite a lot more divided than perhaps some of the sort of leading editors experienced earlier in their career. How have you thought about navigating this tension between independence and division at Vox?
For those in the audience that aren't as familiar with Vox Media, it's a organization of a multiple number of digital first, multimedia first magazines. And I think that it's important that I use the word magazines because I do believe that the freedom of magazines having a more stated value system than independent news gathering organizations like the New York Times and Reuters is part of the challenge I think we have in explaining media writ large to audiences. I think it's very confusing for people to see the New York Times and Fox News and a publication like Vox and try to make sense of what each one is individually doing and why they're individually doing that. Vox was started as a result that I was at the Washington Post a decade ago, and I felt as if the recognition of what audiences needed at the time was unfortunately being subsumed too often by what journalists thought was the right process to take with our work. And I thought your speech was wonderful, as always, very smart. But I think that the part that I always sort of want to critique a little bit, and I understand that we're in a room full of people interested in the study of journalism, is that it still feels a bit as if it's a focus on the pundits, not on what our audience's needs are. I think that inherently underneath what you're saying is what audiences need is a neutral party to create independent journalism that helps create independent journalism. And I hear that from you and from Alessandra as well. But I still think that I still feel as an industry we are confusing our audiences, even in very subtle ways. And I just want to call out one of them. You wrote down that people think that we are creating something in service of an agenda, and that is a negative sign. But I actually think that it's a very small step from agenda to editorial judgment. There was a very clear period of time that you put the COVID tracker on the homepage of the New York Times every single day. And you could say that was an agenda to help, that some people might think that it was an agenda to push that COVID was a virus that actually was killing many, many people. You could also say COVID was a virus that was killing many, many people, and it was your editorial responsibility to put that on the front page of the New York Times every single day. And I think a large swath of audiences out there don't understand the difference, the subtle difference between editorial judgment and agenda setting. And so I'd be curious, in magazines, I think in the magazine world, it's easier for us to assert that we do have an editorial agenda, but I'm curious how you all think of that.
Agenda is an interesting word there. Look, editorial judgment is, it's why you want expert journalists, right? We're not in the profession of being stenographers, right? We're not just fact intake machines, or even worse, just allegation intake machines. It spits them out as if everything is equally, equally credible. I think it's absolutely true that journalists are exercising editorial judgment. But does that editorial judgment then pass the independence, threshold, right? Are you pursuing a story that you wish to be true, even when the facts aren't aligning with it? Are you abandoning the story when it's no longer defensible to pursue it without acknowledging any of that, right? You can see a little bit about how Fox has handled the Hunter Biden informant story there, right? Continuing to hype something, and then the second it doesn't play out, pretending that it didn't happen. So I still think, I can walk you through all the logic of COVID tracker, right? It had still eclipsed, to the highest, one of the highest thresholds of deaths. It was being used very actively to shape personal decision making. The tracking data was informing every journal, a cascade of other great journalism we were producing. We were among the earlier organizations to recognize the massive disparities in deaths between people of color and white people, for example. I think that is an example of a central issue of the day pursued independently. And then, as the story starts to recede, the Times isn't trying to force it into the public eye. We're tracking the downturn of these cases, and then moving to the next step of what an independent news organization should do, which is to look at the lessons, right? What do we do right? What do we do wrong as a society? Which countries got this moment right, and how does America fare? At times it looked like we had fared very, very badly, and at times others, which states handled it the best. So I don't think editorial judgment in any way is incompatible with independence. I think it's in many ways a requirement.
Yeah, I want to open this up to everyone, but I think that maybe my question there is not so much whether it's incompatible, but whether audiences understand it well enough. or if it's sort of a black box that goes.
Audiences don't understand anything we do well enough as an industry.
Okay.
And we should just be really clear about that.
That should not stop us from doing our journalism.
Yeah.
Just because the audience don't understand it, because I mean,
Yeah.
I believe we should continue to do what is the right thing.
I think I agree with both of you, which is we could keep doing it and we should explain it better. I mean, that's like one of our great lessons is anything that's implicit in the digital era is misunderstood. And so if something as central as credibility is implicit, then that means that credibility is being misunderstood. And boy, is that on us to do a better job explaining where where the credibility of our work comes from.
Yeah, so we're slightly different, obviously, because the bulk of our business is we're a B2B business. So we provide news to other news organizations. So in a sense, and because those other news organizations are around the world and clients around the world, they want different things. A story that might be really big in the U.S., nobody cares about in Japan, and so in a sense that protects us. But the biggest part of our business actually is for a financial audience, right? Our biggest client is the London Stock Exchange Group, which then has a terminal which provides to financial investors. And providing news to financial investors is really instructive because their only bias is making money, right? That's their only agenda. And so it's really instructive in that if you don't give them the facts and you don't tell them the true point of view from wherever they're investing, then they'll never come back to you. And increasingly, that client base that is on the other side of that financial terminal, by the way, they are capitalists in the sense that they believe in the market, but they certainly don't, the increasing bulk don't actually come from markets that would consider themselves sort of, going back to your point about capitalism and communism, right? And more of the world's money is actually in private hands from countries that actually have a completely different view from what the US and Europe want. And again, that is instructive because to them, again, you just got to give them the information that will then make them make better investment decisions without, we don't actually tell them buy or sell, obviously that's not, but if you give them the information that makes them make better decisions. And that I think is instructive in general, right? That is how we avoid bias, or we try, look, do we get it right all the time? No. But it's very instructive in everything we do. So not just the agency business, not, but also our third rail, which is our new sort of B2C, it's not so new, but our sort of consumer presence, which we're trying to build. And this is the year, in fact, we're trying to build it more and more. And we're hoping to learn from how we've covered financial markets for financial investors, because I do think it is instructive. And I think the way it translates into sort of general, if you will, news, is if you have to give people information, explanation, context, insight, that helps them make proper decisions. And that's why, the Reuters Institute years ago, when you saw that increase in trust, right, during COVID, it was because people actually needed to rely on that news to know whether to get vaccinated, to know where, whether not to drink Lysol or whatever it was, And then we saw that. It was like when it really mattered to you, you actually went to those news organizations that you thought were trusted. And of course it went back down again. So as the world sort of, went to pot. But that's the way that's the way we square it, because such a big part of our business is really, aimed at making better decisions, for those who consume it.
I'd like to return to Melissa's example of the COVID tracker and the sort of the zone where an editorial judgment becomes an expression of a set of values that people who may disagree with them might perceive as an agenda. So, for example, a major upmarket Finnish newspaper for a long period of time had a calculator on the landing page of their app and in front of their homepage that calculated how many days were left till the carbon budget that we have before 1.5 becomes inevitable is spent. Could the New York Times do that? And if you did it, would that be an editorial judgment or an expression of a set of values that could be perceived as an agenda? And if so, how is it different from the COVID tracker?
because we're all journalists, we're so intrigued in like, where's the exact line, right? Like, where's the line between, editorial judgment and, and an agenda or a bias or in some way. I want to say like really directly, I think my grandfather had a line, so like this is not like a new thought, but like he used to say that when you buy the New York Times, you're not just buying the news, you're buying judgment, right? And that's because the news is being reported and then contextualized and then shared by like best-in-class professionals, by expert journalists, many of whom have deep expertise in the very topics they're writing about, right? Are steeped in the communities that they're writing about. So I certainly don't want to suggest that that the Times or any other news organization should lose its ability to sort of pick its spots and to say, this is something worthy of attention. I just think that you can use an independent process to get to what is worthy of attention, and then an independent process to figure out what story that topic yields, and then use an independent process to figure out the best way to tell that story and the best way to present it, right? So, so in that example, right, like climate change is, one of the central stories of our era, right? And a really tricky one to tell. So like for us, we have one of the largest, if not the largest, climate team in the industry, and very expert, very gifted writers. But we discovered that people were really having a hard time. We were having a hard time having their work break through, right? And why? It's pretty obvious, right? Every climate story sounds a little bit like the last one, and you could sort of guess the final paragraph before you start, right? So like the climate stories were just struggling to surprise in a way you need a little bit of surprise in order to have people read past the headline, right? So Dean, our former editor, I think really brilliantly decided to give that team to a visual journalist, an editor who's a visual journalist. And our climate coverage went visual journalism first. And everything we produced surprised, because no one had ever seen climate coverage like that. And it allowed folks to find a different way into an objectively important story, a story that objectively requires our time and attention and ultimately society's, efforts to address in some way. And that wasn't an all or nothing thing. We still write stories all the time on the climate desk. But I think, you could probably put a phrase like agenda next to that. I just don't, I don't think of it that way. I think of it as like a great journalist, a great independent journalist trying to find the right way to get an important story to an audience that we believe deserves that story.
Maybe this is part of the tension. But maybe this is part of the tension.
Well, can I ask a quick question? Please. Because as the tech guru in this group, so if we're going to now soon have AI tools that are essentially going to let everybody custom make the news information and insight that they want, does that problem go away? In other words, that if around the world, whether you're a client like one of our clients or whether you're a consumer, and you're going to find a way to go through all the New York Times, like that, what you ever did, what you're doing now, and just sort of pick and choose what you want. Does that problem go away, or does it get accentuated? It's a legitimate question. I don't know.
The problem of sort of editorial of independence or agenda setting.
You just choose it. You're not just forced to look at what the New York Times has on its front page. You can go deep into the guts of the New York Times and choose what you want.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rasmus. I know you're a moderator, but
and she is a guru.
I haven't mentioned AI yet, which I thought was strange.
Yeah. I want to be very clear that I have no idea. That's partly why I'm visiting Oxford right now. Is that I think that there's a really interesting moment in journalism that I saw play out 10 years ago when there was a lot of disruption in the space and a lot of opportunity in the space. And I'm seeing that happen right now. I think there's a lot of we're in a transitional moment for journalism, and it's both very exciting and very frightening. I think that you laid out a very frightening picture today of what journalists have to deal with to do a great job day in and day out. And that could leave a lot of us with especially organizations that are starting out and trying to build audiences and aren't established like Reuters or the New York Times, sort of throwing up their arms and being like, this maybe I'll go to law school. But I actually feel very excited and optimistic about some of the lessons I think AI specifically is implying about our industry. And it goes a little bit to what you're saying, is that we offer something that is trusted humans being able to make journalistic decisions, show journalistic process, and show journalistic decision making. And if we can do this right, I don't have the answers for it. If we can do this right and show people what our value is, I think there's a huge opportunity for us to reinvigorate people's lives with journalism again. I think that what I worry about, when you mentioned this with the COVID trust spike, the fact that the COVID trust spike happened and then went back down, or the trust in journalism went up during COVID and then went back down, that to me feels like we're making a product that people know has value, but they're not consistent in recognizing that value. And so what is our job in figuring out how to better market our product to the world? And can you say, okay, look, there's great robotic reports, and then there's great journalistic analysis, interpretation, deep investigation, contextualization. Why is it that I use Wikipedia and I read Reuters? But I use them for different reasons. And so how can we further set ourselves apart in this moment, or use this as a moment to set ourselves further apart? But again, I think that this goes back to how do we tell the story about what we do, and how do we identify what is individually each of our journalistic expertise in this moment in time. In some ways, I actually worry less about the established audiences that we have and more about the audiences that have just completely given up on journalism, or that are, I've been here on the stage before, and I've said this. I think that Fox News is oftentimes journalistic malpractice, but there's still a large part of the U.S. audience that is following Fox News, thinking of it as a capable journalistic outlet. So, what is our role in this industry to help explain to those audiences? And maybe that's not the role of Reuters, and maybe that's not the role of the New York Times, but I do think it's the role of many of us in this industry to think about how do we reach those who are not being reached right now.
I mean, I think there are three things that are coming out here, two of which were very present in your lecture and have also come out in the conversation now, and one that's perhaps particularly clear in the conversation now, right? So the first one is the importance of process. It's very clear in your argument. It's very clear that everyone on the panel here recognized that value. The second then is that you, I think, suggested in parts of the lecture, and it came out very clearly here in the conversation now, that many of you feel that the public doesn't understand that process. And no one really queried that statement, and I think that's probably true for parts of the public. But it's also thought-provoking, right? If we're so certain that the value is the process, and we recognize that the public doesn't understand the process or see how that creates value, we're beginning to work towards a third point, which I think has really only come out in the conversation now, and I think, Melissa, you raised it very clearly, which is that the value is only realized in the connection with the public. And I think the way we talk about it here, I think, is still very centered on what it's looked like from the point of view of journalists and newsrooms. And the concern about personalization, for example. The thing I always say as someone who, with colleagues at the Institute, do a lot of research on how people engage with news and media and how they use media, is that all news consumption has always been, and always will be personalized. The only question is who does the personalization. Is it going to be you as an editor? Is it going to be me as a user? Or is it going to be some algorithm that I as a user delegated to because you didn't do your job? This is the only question. Is which mix of these three factors. It's always been like that, it always will be. The only thing that's changed over time is that as a user, I have more to choose from. And from my point of view, as a user, and much of the public feels the same, that is a good thing. It's very challenging for the industry, but the value is only created in that connection with the public. And I think it's pretty clear from the conversation here that we see a lot of the value being created in the process, but the public doesn't necessarily recognize that value or even have a sense of how that process adds value to it.
All that you have said is right, but we have largely focused in this discussion and the lecture as well about the news gathering and processing and publishing it. What we have missed out is the editorials and the opinions in a particular newspaper or a media outlet, where we are often accused of having an agenda. Whether it's true or not, probably AG is the right person to let us know. But that is the area where the selection of opinion articles, as well as your take on editorial on any issue, whether international or local.
I think I'll take a last round of responses from the panel on this, and then I'm conscious that we have a great group of people in the room, and I want to make sure there is at least some chance for asking questions as well. So I'll take a sort of a round of responses on this point, and then we'll begin to open it up. So Melissa, do you want to take a stab at this?
I'll just be quick on it. Again, it's easier for me because I have been working in the space of magazines, but I think that that's actually an even more complicating factor for newspapers because I think it confuses our audiences even further. So I feel strongly that one of the things that we did when we started Vox was to clearly say that we weren't going to label our news opinion or news. We were going to say that we were reported analysis. And that was important to me because I have always felt that the use of opinion and news is a division that makes sense to journalists and doesn't make sense to audiences.
AG, do you want to take a stab at this?
On the opinion question specifically, I mean, one thing I would say, to your broader point on what the public is seeing on this, I'm a believer in the value of editorial judgment, and editorial judgment really is a proxy for journalistic expertise. Like I'm a believer in the value of great reporters and great editors, and I do think one helpful counterpoint, and one reason why ultimately I am optimistic that there's a market for the type of independent journalism that I'm talking about, is that the places that have grown in recent years are disproportionately the ones that have invested in the quality of the work, the expertise of the journalists, and in ensuring and even reinforcing the core enduring values and standards. And that's obviously we've grown, but the Post has grown, the Journal has grown. Like great magazines like the New Yorker and the Atlantic. I just did a podcast with the FT. The FT has grown, right? All of those are at historic highs for the number of people that they're reaching, and I think all are fundamentally investing. I'm sure the same is true with Reuters and Bloomberg and others. So anyway, I do think that there is some optimism that. I take your point on personalization, that everything is a personalized choice, but I also think there is a value to having a news organization say, this isn't trending, it's not even heart of hearts, particularly interesting, and we're going to put it on the top of our page anyway, because we owe you something, which is we owe you our best effort to share with you the most important thing you need to know today. And right now it happens to be, some semi-obscure international conflict, right? So on the opinion question, I don't know how much I have to add. I think that there's, I think that great opinion journalism should basically have a commitment to the same underlying processes, right? A willingness to have your hypothesis disproved, an insistence on checking the facts, right? Not playing around with straw men on the other side, but actually reckoning with the sharpest critiques of your argument. Restrictions and conflicts of interest and corrections of errors, right? The core sort of package of process, I think, basically endures. But then, each piece at like the product level sort of fails the independence test, right? Because like each piece is advocating an opinion, right? It's like, isn't that sort of the opposite of what I've been arguing? I think that the way it can, an independent section can pass the product test is at the package level, not at the story level. If the question that me and Katie Kingsbury, our extremely talented editor of the opinion section, ask ourselves is like, would you understand the American abortion debate post fall of Roe being overturned, Roe v. Wade being overturned, just by reading the mix of opinions here? Would you understand the ideas animating this debate? Or would you understand the range of views and experiences around the conflict in Gaza? And if the answer is yes, then we're doing something right and we're meeting that independence bar.
Well, I mean, we don't do opinion, and unless Simon, who's creating our new app and website, hasn't told me anything, we don't plan to do opinion. So I can't answer that. In fact, we're quite strict about telling our journalists that while we believe in free speech, they need to leave their opinions, where it be political, religious, or otherwise, at home. So.
One opinion we share very strongly here is that you should have a chance to ask some questions. So now we will open it up, and I'll try to make an effort to get a diverse range of voices in the room. So we will start here in the front next to Eduardo. And if you could please introduce yourself when you ask your question, ideally end with a question mark and direct it at one of the panelists.
It's Maria Ramirez. I'm a journalist from El Diario from Spain, and it's a question to AG. To what extent do you think Trump is a threat for democracy and for the free press? Compare also with 4 years ago, 8 years ago, so what we already lived through. Thank you.
I don't really think of myself as a particularly talented pundit. So maybe I'll talk about how we approach that question journalistically. We have, spent, I guess it's like eight years now, investigating, Trump and covering his actions and conducts and plans in office, out of office, and prior to his election, right? And I think a disproportionate amount of what the world knows about his plans and conduct is from our investigative reporters who have, dug through and found things like, finally got we're able to paint a full picture of his finances by getting his taxes. An investigation that took 5 years, and our beat reporters. So now as he's returning, as he's running for re-election, and right now he's the favorite to win, right? Like, we should be very clear on that. One of the most important questions is what does he do in office? And I think you can look at a mix of what did he do, right? And what are his stated plans? Who are the people he's putting around him? And I think one of the most important bodies of work that we created in the last year, our colleagues Maggie Haberman, Jonathan Swan, and Charlie Savage spent basically the entire year digging in to what does Trump's first year, and it was called like the Trump 25 project. And they got to know everyone in his world and orbit, the folks who are shaping the sort of like intellectual architecture of his term. But also they've gotten in his head and understood like what is his mindset, like what did he learn from the last term, about how effectively to wield the powers of the office. And I think when you get that whole picture together, he is clearly running on a more overtly anti-democratic platform than any candidate, in certainly well over any major party candidate in well over a century, right? There's no disputing that. He's taking direct aim at, countless institutional norms, with plans to dismantle the civil service, with plans to weaponize the Justice Department, with plans to greatly expand executive authority. So it's, you know, it's a really, really important story. And I feel like our job is, you know, America will vote the way it votes. Our job is to make sure it has all the information that we can humanly possibly give them, and context that we can humanly possibly give them.
Luis Malin.
Yeah, it's a.
My name is Nelly Reyes from Venezuela. I have a question for AG and Alessandra. In 2016, the New York Times launched the Spanish edition. A few years later, they closed. I would like to know what is the lesson that you have learned about this initiative, if you now believe it's a mistake, it was a mistake or something like this or not. And in the case of Alessandra, talk about a little more about how to publish information in another language, not only in English, because in Spanish we need a lot of information and good journalism. And sometimes we find that we had El País, for example, de España, but we miss a lot of global newspaper or global media talking about our issues also.
That's great. For my part of it, it's pretty straightforward. It just never built an audience, right? People weren't using it. And I think, you know, one of the mistakes I think news organizations, particularly in this period of limited resources, can make is to let things that aren't working go too long. And so we thought it was a really good team. We thought it was a really good product, but we couldn't find a way for people to engage with it in a way that made sense to continue.
Yeah, I mean, Spanish is one of our main languages. We have many clients throughout Central and South America. It is a really vibrant area of business for us. You know, again, it's slightly different. We're B2B mainly business, although we do publish much, not just text, but a video also in Spanish. So it's a huge area for us. We have a huge bureau in Spain and you know, across Latin America. So we'll continue doing so.
I've been exceedingly enthralled with the arguments up here and thus very poor at my timekeeping. So unfortunately, I'll take 3 questions in a row now. Okay. And I'll ask the questioners to keep their questions very short, and then we'll distribute them amongst the panelists. So we have Umar, and next to Umar, a strongly lit and patient backlit person. And then towards the end here, Edward, who's also been very patient.
Thank you very much. My name is Omar Zomre from Burkina Faso. For me, independent journalism is being capable of thinking inside and outside the box. So after 5 generations at New York Times, so how have you witnessed the move of your readers, if I want to color it like red from Republican and blue from Democrats? How have you seen that shift?
Hi, I'm Rosina Breen. I'm the Editor-in-Chief and CEO at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. My question is for AG, really. I read recently, I think it was a Reuters interview, you said in the context of generative AI, we can't allow a world in which the right of a news organisation to be paid for the work that spends money and takes time and care and often risks to create disappears. We're a non-profit independent newsroom. We've covered stories, we've delivered stories around how Qatar hacked the World Cup, how Roman Abramovich is linked to Vladimir Putin, human rights abuses at Del Monte farm in Kenya, and so on. We're currently fighting a case in the High Court of one of our stories that has been deemed a slap. That's costing us $500K so far. My question really is about business model and business advice. So we co-publish with big legacy newsrooms, Reuters, The Guardian, the BBC, the New York Times, Die Welt. We don't get paid for the journalism. And so we're starting those conversations now. And I guess I'd like to know from your perspective, how should we start the conversations about getting paid to help sustain the work that we do?
Thank you. And then a final question at the end here. And I'm really sorry that we will have to have other questions informally over drinks when we wrap up. So Edward.
Thanks very much, AG, for an excellent speech. My question is really about, back to newsroom discipline. and back to what you felt were some of the lessons of, in the aftermath of Trump's shock win back in 2016. And the criticism, or some of the criticism at the time about the New York Times was there's a little bit of loss of editorial discipline, a drift towards editorialization, and in particular, I think, comments from your then media editor about the need for a different set of rules were controversial. The use of the word lie and liar in connection to Trump were controversial. I'm just wondering whether you've been thinking about how to assert some newsroom discipline should there be another Trump victory.
Great.
I think they're all. You can return
No
to the
pressure.
lecture.
All right. I'm going to give the tough ones to Melissa, and I'll take. Okay, so let me take them in order, because honestly, I may need to be reminded a little bit as we go. So, on the last one, I think I have a slightly different read, right? So, I think two things simultaneously happened. I think that Trump's defiance of all these longstanding norms, I think challenged the longstanding norms inside newsrooms in really helpful ways, actually, right? Like my, I keep quoting my family, I'm sorry. Now I think I'll have gotten every generation. My great-grandfather had a line, I believe in an open mind, but not so open your brain falls out. And, which I like, to me, like, if I was to, in a more flip way, summarize independence, it's a little bit of that, And I think that Trump, we had never before had a president who would, for example, get up at the presidential podium, cite a bunch of information that just wasn't true, right? That just wasn't true. And so it left us in this sort of bizarre position, which is like, normally you can quote a statement without caveat that the President of the United States has just issued from the presidential podium, right? But in this case, like, you can't confidently do that. And so we introduced a phrase that drove his team crazy, which is, he said without offering any evidence. And I remember like hearing from one member of his team who was very upset about this. And I said, yeah, but every time he says something that isn't true, you like wave it away and you say, well, you can't take everything he says seriously. And now you're complaining that we're basically saying he said, but you can't take everything he said seriously, right? So I think that the Trump era helped our industry move away from some journalistic conventions that probably did a little more harm than good, right? Did that open up some risk as you did that? I believe, talking about digital transformation, so like, it is impossible not to swing too far if you want to, if you make meaningful changes, right? It's like you always end up having to oscillate a couple of times before you find yourself in the right spot. So I'm sure the example, that your point is right, that at times we swung too far. But I think ultimately that period is pretty healthy. The caveat, can I just add one?
Sorry.
The caveat, well, I just think there was two different trends that happened at once. So you have Trump. It is also peak media Twitter, that era. And I think that media Twitter was perhaps the most insidious and self-destructive force in our industry, because you took a profession where like all of us came up with editors saying, anytime you see a pack of reporters all staring over there, like that's where the story is, look over here. And media Twitter taught us a different lesson, which is anytime you see a pack of reporters staring over here, yell it louder, right? And I think that it probably took our industry a little too long to realize that media Twitter was this like very intense force for intellectual conformity in our profession. And I do think people have recognized that, and Musk has certainly helped the cause with his management of the platform.
No, I was just going to say, I totally agree with you that I think actually Trump was good in that sense for the disciplined newsrooms. But I was just going to add what you mentioned, sort of the work that Maggie and Co have been doing on Trump
Yeah.
25, there is a lot of information that we have from Trump 1 that is very instructive. We don't have to say it's true, what he's saying now is true or not true, because there's a ton of evidence now, that you can point to, which is very different from what was happening before 2016. So you can sort of point to the facts and say, this is what was said, this is what was done, and this is what was not done. So I was just going to point out your coverage that took that approach, which I think is spot on.
Oh, that's great to hear. Okay, second question, business model. I don't think I'm going to be able to squeeze this one into the time. What I will say is, first of all, a lot of admiration for the work that you all have been doing, so thank you. Second, I don't think that our country has really reckoned with our society has reckoned with whether or not it wants to be informed. I think we need to just say this in stark, unapologetic ways. In the United States, I think there's something like 3 times, even now, after brilliant, passionate people have spent 15 years trying to find a nonprofit path for journalism, and the number of outlets are growing every year, right? Even now, I think we're probably spending something like twice as much money on ballet companies, charitable monies on ballet companies, than an informed public. And that's not anything against ballet. It's just it's a sobering choice. We don't make that choice with, say, higher education, right? We don't make that choice with any other number of major issues, like the environment, right? But we do make it with informed society, and particularly informed local communities. And I don't know the path there. I really don't, because I feel like society needs to wake up that this is something that we need to care about. That every other challenge we face, in some ways, cascades down from good information and responsible context.
Can I just say one,
Yeah.
just to play a little devil's advocate on that one? I think that critique is a little unfair to audiences, because I think people are looking for information and seeking out information. I think they don't think journalism can provide it. And I think you're saying funders not necessarily are thinking that the way to fund an informed society is through journalism. But I do think that people are looking for information and seeking out information, and I think that they are getting it from places in the U.S. in particular, from places like Joe Rogan or random YouTube creators, and that's what I think is actually really. I want to shake us even more to say, if that's where they're getting their information from, our product isn't providing the right approach for these audiences.
To tie this together is to take Umar's challenge and sort of ask the question of how you think the public has changed in the generations your family's been stewards of the New York Times.
Yeah. I hear your point. I really do. Yeah. I also think there's something to civic responsibility. And I believe that in my core. And I believe that we as a society, I was really mostly talking about funders there. They're literally giving more money to ballet companies than they are to informed communities. But I don't think we should take the pressure off of the public to feel some responsibility as well to be an informed citizen, right? That assumption is at the very heart of democracy, right? It is the foundational thought of democracy is that we, as a society, give everyone the chance to contribute, and those people will take that responsibility seriously and make informed decisions. So I don't think this is first and foremost a public a problem or challenge, but I hate it when we shy away from it as a profession. That some of this is not everything should be wrapped in entertainment in order to be heard, in my view. So how have things changed? Well, I've only really been around for this era, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because the last era, it sounds like you mostly just collected cash as it came off of printing presses. And like in this era, it definitely feels like we are just like finding every possible way to find a sustainable path forward for the like very complicated and expensive work that we do. I don't think of a political shift, you know. So one lesson Alan wrote an interesting review of a book on the modern history of the Times from like the mid-'70s, and I also read the book, the precursor book to that. And when you take them all together, like one of the things you really realize is that that the Times has basically had an enduring mission, and then a tremendous willingness to change in service of that enduring mission. Even in ways that were sort of shocking at the time, and you know, that enduring mission to me is like original, reported, independent, expert on the ground journalism that's held to like the highest standards of you know, independence and accuracy and fairness, and is basically created in the public service. But it's basically reporting, right? Like, great reporting is that enduring mission, but all the ways that it takes life, like change generation after generation. And it's why I try not to be, even as, you know, I can sort of lament, you know, the easiness of a different era, too much of a curmudgeon about it, because I do think that journalism has gotten better and smarter in all sorts of ways, and more creative in all sorts of ways. And you know, I mean, just like the lack of diversity even 30 years ago in our newsroom is shocking. And you know, the stories we're finding today, just because we have like a broader swath of humanity looking for stories, is really striking. So I feel like a lot has changed, but I don't really think of it in terms of how the audience is constituted. Although even there, it's like, you know, we used to be a place that could only reach, you know, the small section of humanity that was like within, you know, a 2-hour drive from Manhattan, where we printed the paper, and you know, and now we have a subscriber in every country on earth. And so even that, you know, feels like it is broadened our lens and like made journalism, you know, feel like is more capable of doing more than it's ever done.
It's very clear, as AG outlined in his lecture, we live in deeply divided societies, but I think there are at least two things that everyone in this room have in common. The first one is utter contempt for my inability to manage time in this discussion, so that everyone could ask a question who wanted to. And the second one is profound gratitude to the panelists and to AG Sulzberger in particular for an extraordinary lecture. So thank you very much. Drinks outside now.